Greetings and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my mind rather than my heart, although to my heart as well, I have to say, and that is the notion of community and the transformation, both the concept and the thing itself has undergone in the last few decades, particularly in the last two, or maybe one, very rapid. And I'm joined by my friend and guest who will talk about his own perspective because he comes from the Chinese Vietnamese diaspora, which is quite interesting. But before launching into the specific details and the minutiae of the topic, I want to introduce this idea of what community used to be and what it has become. So these days, you'll find frequently that people talk about gaming communities, the Destiny player base, the Destiny community, the World of Warcraft community, the whatever community, Legend of Zelda community, right? Final Fantasy. What do they people mean by that? Well, they mean basically a bunch of people who play these games. They mean fan base. They mean gamers, enthusiasts. People will talk about the MGTOW community. They will talk about the progressive community. They will talk about the Twitch community. What are all these things? What all these things have in common is effectively uh, common interests more than anything else. So whether it's gaming or an ideological commitment or just a range of topics, people have evolved the term community from one thing into something quite distinct, namely a bunch of people online getting together, participating in joint interests. And that's interesting. But when we compare it to the old sense of community, a community that very much was part of IRL, which itself was kind of ironic, real world, well, you have to realize that the kinds of communities people talk about today aren't real communities. They lack the support networks, they lack the neighborliness, they lack the reliability, and a lot of people will jump the gun and say, well, it's all down to X reason. It's down to multiculturalism. It's down to feminism. It's down to neoliberalism. It's down to whatever you might be. And it's entirely possible that all of these things might be at least partially valid. But we have to think about the origin of community. The origin of communities be found effectively in hardship and the necessity to survive. Some very bright hominid in the past realized, for example, that, well, if I just do this alone, if I go it alone, I'll be less effective than working with other people or fellow hominids, cooperating. And so this notion of cooperation probably was the first instance of organization amongst primates, which then led to other iterations of it. Eventually, it's led to a sense of community because people would rely upon each other, born of necessity, as I stated, in a hostile environment that would aid them in survival and reproduction. And this notion of community continued for quite some time, up till comparatively recently, very recently, because the world of abundance and plenty that we know is a very, very, very recent phenomenon, a blink of an eye in terms of geological or even just hominid evolutionary time. And what we've seen is a disappearance of this. So more so than anything else, I would hypothesize the reason why we've seen a marked disappearance in traditional notions of community is not simply down to politics or cultural influence, but rather the very fact that community was born in the fires of hardship and the links that bound people in that scenario, in that situation, were links that needed to be there in order for small groups of people to survive. And so the fact that you could rely on a neighbor to get something done because you're off doing X or what have you, that was a given. And likewise, it was, I'll scratch your back and you'll scratch mine. And I think the leftovers we see of that in the 20th century and leading up to the 21st, throughout the 80s, those are just that, I think, leftovers. I don't think it was a sudden shift. And yes, there were cultural influences, there are other factors involved, but ultimately, I think the notion of community can only exist in a world where hardship and survival necessity begets it. And without that, of course, you end up in deep doo-doo because you, the lone individual, will not survive. Not so much anymore. You don't, in air quotes, need anyone anymore, not in that sense. And so community has taken on new terms. I just wanted to put that out there. I'm not known for being particularly Spartan or succinct with my words, so I do apologize. But let's move on. So that's my hypothesis. The ultimate hypothesis, I would say, rather than the sort of proximate. There are other proximate reasons why communities have evaporated. But I'll turn the podium over to my colleague. So, bearing in mind what I've just said, what are your thoughts before we get into the nitty-gritty details on loss of community throughout the industrialized world?
Well, I think with regard to community, I think a lot of people, the conception of community now is very different from the conception of community back then because the community was something that you could pass down in the past. Whereas now we're just kind of building new ones, and if those break down, and those tend to break down really easily because, in my opinion, a lot of these communities tend to be fragmented in multiple ways. Um, when it comes to the older sense of community, the community was multi-generational. These things were a lot more solid. And if you look at a lot of internet communities now, it's just one piece of drama happens and then everything falls apart. Or if you look on many Discord servers, especially the public ones, you see people come and go, right? Or there's different eras of a certain type of prominent group that will come together and then just leave once they found their own group.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about before. Internet communities really have taken on a completely, even though the rubric's the same, the actual form and substance is completely different, as you just pointed out. Paper thin, really, just people come and go. They're not certainly not synonymous with older notions of a reliable network of people, right?
Right. I mean, like at the end of the day, a lot of people are of a similar opinion of internet friends aren't the same as your real life friends, right?
Mm,
You can't rely on them to do certain things. There are certain protocols in real life where your real life friends can come up to you and say, "Oh, hey, let's go do something," and they can physically drag you outside. Whereas, you get stuck with internet friends, and it's a nice thing every now and then, but it can be a trap in the sense that you're not able to tackle real life problems, and that's just a factor.
mm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the one thing about the internet, the quote unquote communities. They are fundamentally unhelpful when it comes to, yeah, tackling real life issues. At best, they are good at ameliorating absolute states of isolation, because you can hop on wherever and interact with people, but they're really there for sort of common interests. Again, you have gaming communities, you have sort of ideological communities where they typically talk about the same topics day in and day out. And even a departure from that often can just lead, as you pointed out, to fragmentation. I mean, the minute in a gaming community you stop playing X game, you're kind of gone. Not for reasons of malice or anything, but rather you just don't, you're not interested in the game anymore, so you leave. Or if you belong to some sort of ideological community but had a change of heart or mind, then that could precipitate you leaving as well. So yeah, um, it's just a completely different notion, a completely different thing. And I get it, lexically speaking, words change meaning over time. But the interesting thing you brought up just now with real life friends is my observation, which I've alluded to in the past, that it's becoming increasingly difficult to acquire quote unquote real life friends, particularly for the youth. And so this also incentivizes moving towards quote unquote online communities, online platforms to at least simulate, approximate what one would otherwise have in real life and what one might deem to be, in fact, better or more more substantive and certainly more beneficial in real life. But if that's the only thing you can get, right? It's a bit like, it's a bit like the rise of the streamer chick who simulates some kind, in some very vague sense, girlfriend experience, if only through the repetition and the familiarity. So yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the crux of the issue. The question, in addition to sort of my own hypothesis of a hyper technical world that has eliminated the need to cooperate for the sake of survival and basic reproduction, a world of abundance, what sort of the nitty-gritty details of that are, and how different people different people get by in that scenario. So, for example, this is why you're such a fascinating specimen, no pun intended, that you have for a good part of your life existed in your own community as a Chinese, Vietnamese, uh, quote unquote ethnic minority, as the term goes these days. Although I think we should qualify that because you're not properly Vietnamese. You're one of the many members of the Chinese diaspora that spread out throughout Southeast Asia to then dominate those places economically, so to speak.
Right, yeah, because my own family had left China in the 1900s and they moved to Vietnam later on. So although they do have a mix of some things linguistically, culturally Vietnamese, at the base of their core and the way that they act and the way that they operate in the world is more so Chinese in that respect. And because of that experience of having to adapt to another culture, my own family is like a little bit different too, because they're just again immigrants into the U.S. and they have adapted some American customs
Sure,
to that too. So
but
so
but
things have like mutated.
but you of course would differentiate your experience from the experience of, say, the typical European American or
Right,
Hispanic
right,
American or what have you.
yeah. Just because like even with the trauma of escaping war, like that is intergenerational.
You're referring
And
to the Vietnam War.
yeah, referring to the Vietnam War, and even in the early 1900s, certain parts of China were going through famine, and that's why my mother's side in particular had left just to avoid that famine. And a lot of those stories are still passed down. Things are still traditional to a certain extent, but traditional in the sense that you are preserving a certain memory, a certain feeling, a certain sentiment, right? And this is kind of somewhat what I would call a familial community sense, where you're able to pass down these sentiments, which is kind of the problem now with just kind of tying this back in with a lot of communities, is that a lot of communities now are new, they're in their childhood state, but they're so volatile that they are not able to establish this kind of history amongst their members. And without that kind of um, history being able to be passed down, I don't think that a lot of communities can be solid, right? Because you see a lot of people or even like friend groups, when they do rely on something, when there is nothing to talk about, they do rely on looking back to the past. Oh, these are the good times, right? Whether or not the times were good or whatever. Um, the
Absolutely.
more,
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of these communities are, if they have run out of quote unquote content, right, or something new, they rely on shared experiences of the past.
Yeah, and this raises a good point because despite what a lot of people believe in former times, there wasn't a great deal of mobility, and so you spoke of sort of intergenerationality, so to speak. This was the hallmark of many communities that would just, frankly speaking, sit in one place for generations. Not always, but frequently. Or if they did move, they would move in a diasporic sense, as in your case, the case of many of the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia. And this would reinforce things over generations. I think you're really touching upon an important point here, in the sense that you basically need time to establish community. And again, the other thing, what I mentioned at the outset, that trial and tribulation tends to reinforce the notion of community. So I believe that community ultimately, from an evolutionary perspective, emerged in the face of necessity to survive and reproduce. But its continuity oftentimes was predicated on, frankly speaking, yeah, adversity and trouble. And so you look at various minority groups that have existed in the world, and the ones that seem to have the quote unquote strongest communities, or the most insular, are typically the ones that operated as a minority in sort of like, well, certain certainly in Southeast Asia, with the Chinese diaspora there, and there are a few others notable examples. Um, and that reinforces it, right? That you go through hard times, and then the people stick together. They've already banded together. They stick together, and I think without that, without hardship to reinforce, I mean, it goes back to the original point. It's very difficult, in addition to the time factor, to maintain this sense of community. And as you pointed out quite astutely, an online community, which I think is just basically a conglomerate of shared interests, which is paper thin, tissue thin, that can fall apart at the drop of a dime, simply because they're not particularly old. They haven't weathered much, and why would you? It's not critical. I mean, if you lose interest in playing World of Warcraft, it's a shame, I guess, but you move on. Or if you have a political change of heart or mind, and you move on too, sure, it might suck. Um, that's very different from surviving a wartime experience. I think a lot of people don't know that in the context of Vietnam, for example, the Chinese diaspora there was not entirely, but largely despised because they outperformed the locals. And it was very complicated, to say the least. That creates a scenario of hardship and what have you. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's
Most of the most of the locals were uh, outperformed by a lot of people who had moved, even northern Vietnamese people who had moved down south during the Geneva Accords were outperforming the locals. Although that's a little bit due to the president at the time, Ngo Dinh Diep, uh, kind of promoting a lot of the Catholic Northerners, but that's a little
yeah, separate
more
topic, but
extreme. Yeah,
yeah, but it just goes to show though the kind of conditions you need to reinforce true notions of community. Um, Otherwise, it is this sort of paper thin veneer that you can just slap on anything, and you can go your merry way whenever you feel like, and that seems to be very much the situation for most people. But
yeah. I think.
no,
Sorry.
no,
I
go
think
ahead, please.
I think most communities or the newer communities online they suffer from one dimensionality, right? Where they're only there for one topic, and in order to build something more with substance, you really do have to create your own community culture, right? And that's kind of the difficult thing to do, right? You have to build certain traditions, whether that would be something simple as every week you have some kind of event happening day by day, right?
Mm,
And these are traditions that people can come back to that they can expect, right? Or they're more commonly known as quote unquote events, right? Discord events.
yeah, yeah.
And these are things that build more of a community because you get to a point to where you're going above the original purpose of the community and you're building it more on an interpersonal level. But from what I've seen, most communities aren't able to handle that.
I've
Uh,
observed such things. I've seen a couple servers on Discord do this. Sort of basically weekly debates. People propose topics, whatever. I think of course, that's a nice idea. But again, online community, if you need help moving or help with something else, they're not there to help you with that. So you're talking about these things on a spectral level effectively, because that's what we are here, internet specters. And I think
yes.
even granting some sort of regularity and creation of tradition, if you want, wish to call it that, it still doesn't satisfy what I think is the human need to interact at a deeper level, and to feel part of something greater. I mean, one thing that, it's become tiresome to point out, but it's everyone picks up on it. Living in a large city, you'll notice that the average person doesn't know diddly squat about his or her neighbor, and it's not just in poor areas. It's everywhere. It's just I have no idea who the people are in my apartment building, and even when I lived in a smaller place, I didn't really know who they were. We never interacted. Um, there's just no need, it seems. And this, when I look think of sort of the 80s, which was sort of the formative time when I grew up, you still had some of these traditions where you could rely on neighbors, and you would greet people and talk to them. It would actually be quite rare and awkward to say stand in a lift or an elevator and not greet somebody who was a few floors within your living space, so to speak. You would exchange niceties. I'm not no, not saying it was anything special per se, but that's just gone. And so I'm still not convinced that. I think what the online solution is a piecemeal solution. And I spent a lot of time on my channel talking about, obviously, the failure of romantic relationships. They don't work particularly well these days. So we all know this. I've been talking about this for 10 plus years. Uh, but
Definitely.
but one thing that I've been noticing more and more in recent years, and this is, I think, probably a more relevant observation, especially now, is that the younger people in particular, but not exclusively, are struggling to find actual friendship, reliable friendship that really cuts to the heart of matters. And so they're just lost in this ethereal soup of online communities. And I mean, the romantic thing isn't really an option for all sorts of reasons that don't need to be reiterated here. But I think it's catastrophic, frankly, that young people in particular are simply lacking, many of them, opportunities to get to know people and to form fast friendships with them. Um, w whatever the problems of those things might be. And I don't want to I don't want to prognosticate too much, but I know such individuals by whom one with whom one thinks, okay, you're 16 or 17 now. I can foresee the next 20 years playing out. Maybe you'll find some crummy job that you knock out every day and whatever, but everything will remain the same otherwise. There won't be much change. And I think ultimately we forget as social apes that these things are really important. Now, I know a lot of people would jump in here and propose a slew of suggestions of what to do, not just with respect to friendship, but sort of romance. But this stuff doesn't work. I think a lot of people, I've noticed a lot of people in my generation, we're not really boomers, right? I'm Generation X, despite the meme that everyone older than 30 is a boomer, are so out of touch with the youth because they're blinded by their own success, and they're blinded by their own position. Well, you just need to do this so you'll succeed, this sort of thing. No, but one thing that does concern me far more the romantic aspect of things, because the romantic thing has been dead for, arguably a decade, is yeah, this inability to find friendship. And one of the benefits, I must say, to the online aspect of things is that online the online potential is at least theoretically infinite, and so you can touch base with people that you otherwise would not have. I mean, you live in ground zero plus, the Stygian pit I call California. I wish sometimes it would just disappear from existence. Not with, I'd like you to escape before that happens, but just for the record. But
Hopefully.
I just, and yet, without the internet, we would never interact, and we have a number of common interests, and so this has turned out to be a boon for both of us, and yet otherwise, I live in Europe, you live there, and it just wouldn't have happened. So that's nice, absolutely. But um, I have to say, on my end, I never could meet somebody like that just in my daily experience, um, for kind of obvious reasons, and a lot of that has to do with my age and what have you. But yeah, so I'm curious what you think about this this as a young person, because you're in your 20s. This
Mhm.
increasingly difficult challenge for young people to form and find actual friendships that give them that human element that human beings need in order to proceed through life with some sense of social assurance. Um, so go, shoot.
I I think uh, older people kind of have misled younger people in the sense that they haven't exactly taught younger people to think about other things other than their career. So you have this instance of intentionality, but to the extent that that intentionality is permeated through the rest of young people's lives, it's not that great because everyone's intentional about their career. They start thinking about it at by the time they're in high school or maybe even earlier, right? But when it comes to interpersonal relationships, a lot of the times you kind of have to ask, where's the intentionality there? If you ask younger people, oh, what kind of friends do you want to make? What kind of relationships do you want to build? A lot of them really don't know. Or if you ask them to be intentional about their values, or intentional about trying to find the truth, a lot of that's lost on most people. And I think with interpersonal relationships, that requires a level of intentionality in that every action that you take has to have a purpose. It has to have meaning, right, to the other person. And at the same time, the other person has to have a certain level of experience with intentionality so that they're able to recognize that. But the problem with younger people, or people that I'm at my age that I've seen, is that there's this lack of that. There's this lack of experience with being able to identify these kinds of things. And also the lack of making intentional friendships, right? As in, uh, you might have a one-dimensional friendship where you have a similar interest in the beginning, but you have to intentionally go about it in a way where if you actually do want a real relationship with a person, you have to go out of your way to ask, oh, hey, do you want to go do XYZ thing, or do you want to talk, or hey, what do you think of XYZ thing, ABC, 1, 2, 3, right? And it's that slow branching out from the original topic that you're able to build a lot more depth within that relationship. And I think that's been really lost when it comes to real life communities, just because everyone has been so fragmented, especially with the internet now, where if you can't talk to someone about a certain thing, why not just go on the internet and have a much easier conversation, right? Because you and another person will have a certain level of agreement so that you can talk about the deeper level topics that you already want to talk about. Whereas if you were to talk to someone about this in real life, you have to build bridges to get across that fragmentation and to build things up all over again to get to that point of conversation that you would find enjoyable, that deeper level, right? And it's just much more difficult to get through when your neighbor has so much. The gap between you and your neighbors is so vast, right? And if you ask a normal person, do you want to put in that much work just to get that tiny bit of satisfying conversation? Most people would say no. And it's completely reasonable as to why people would prefer online communities just because the relationships are just way more expedient. Uh, and if you genuinely do want to create a community where you have people that will go out of their way for you, that's just way more difficult.
If I may
Um,
quickly just interject, don't want to interrupt,
yeah,
but I think you're it's right on the mark. Expediency in general seems to be the name of the game of basically everything in our current civilization society society civilization is shot through by expediency. What is the easiest, fastest way to go about? I mean, this is it seems an absurd analogy, but I remember some years back a comedian making a joke about some person, I believe it was a woman, complaining that the reception on her mobile had sort of cut out for a few minutes, and this was catastrophic, of course. But this quick expedient, this is something that I think we've all grown accustomed to, and it is, and somehow transferred itself from the layer of things, of objects, to the interpersonal. So rather, as you just very astutely pointed out, I think, go through the bridge building, going through the motions, you just you just find you hop on a server and you just say, oh well, they're talking about whatever your favorite political topic is, go into that. No commitment required. And when you get bored of it, you click and you're gone. And yeah, um, it used to be, and I think that is the ultimate lure, I think, of the online experience. There are many, um, but that ease of finding the exact thing you want, a topic in this case, without having to go through all that effort of maybe having to get to know someone years before you're hanging out, eating a pizza, watching a film, and you have that deep conversation about X, Y, Z, any number of topics. Where there's this year long or long build up in any event, that that can all be circumvented now. But the one thing that doesn't result from, I keep on circling back to this point, is the reliability of human trust and community, as it formerly was known. And it's not just the young people, even my generation. I mean, I've seen people my age or approximately my age, older, a bit younger, just toss away friendships that you would think were quite solid in their makings. But yeah, so how does one go about though encouraging that in real life? Because again, a lot of this is about willy-nilly and arbitrary. If you're in a large metropolitan area, despite all the disadvantages, you also have the advantage that you're more likely to encounter people that you might at least in the beginning sync with, and then you can build something. If you're in the middle of nowhere, for example, in I don't know, say Alaska or Wyoming, it becomes a lot more difficult. And so as a consequence, the only option you have really is the internet for interacting with people. And that, I mean, I don't want to get on a tangent, but my geomaxing video, I should have qualified with say like, the geomaxing, in addition to really to be only an option for people with the money, the means, and probably the looks as well, there are people that are just not going to have access to that due to their circumstances. So I think part of the issue is, yeah, depending where you live. I mean, for all its hideousness, California does, in theory, have a lot of options, opportunities, social ones. So you can take advantage of that. What do you think?
Oh yeah, it definitely does. If you do want to find interesting people in California, they do exist. But the problem is that there's so much what I would call soft gatekeeping, because in order to find these people, you have to go and search into institutions, right? If you wanted to talk about a specific topic, like ironically, you do have to go into university, and there are people that do have nuanced views, but there's so much work that you have to put into learning how to identify things, right? I think that most people are ill-equipped in the sense that they have not developed filters for identifying uh, interesting people, right? Because what are interesting people? What do all interesting people have in common? It's curiosity, right? It's that sense of real intellectualism where they want to find out the truth, right? They're not going to care about flowery language, right? They're going to more so care about what is the actual truth to the matter, to the thing, right? And most of the time in California, I find that you can have more difficult conversations with people. It's just that you have to be able to navigate it on their terms, right? Using their language. And the problem with fragmentation is that if you don't know how to, if you yourself don't know how to communicate with someone in their language, you're just gonna have a difficult time communicating your point, and you just get frustrated, and you don't want to put more effort into that relationship.
Well, you bring up a good point. We haven't even touched upon this, but it's so relevant. I mean, talk about the cultural and political signaling. The layers and layers that people have erected about themselves to prevent any sort of penetration, no pun intended, eh, to because this is part of the problem, right? Especially in a place like California, which is sort of the alt ground zero plus. It's the worst of the worst. If you're part of any sort of mainstream culture, whether you buy into it or not, the fact that you're part of mainstream culture necessitates of you that you nod your head in the virtue signaling, that you nod your head and go along with the expectations of the wider culture. So you might be a dissident, you might disagree on any number of points, cultural, political, or otherwise. But if your job is on the line, or you value the social cachet that your position uh, accords to you, then you're just it's so it seems today these days you have to go through so many more layers. Now it's like the infinite onion. You peel one layer off, and then you find to look for that core of a person. And I think it touches upon what you just said, where you have to you have to address them on their own terms, whether they're actually sincere in their oftentimes very odd beliefs or not. You have to go through this protocol of unmasking them one by like, bit by bit, by bit, until you finally get to some core that you can identify as actual human or the authentic part of this person. Um, that wasn't always the case. I mean, people talk about it all the time, but everything is politicized these days. It's everything, This is the- everything, everything. And so to approach a person is is very difficult. And I'm a member of a few quote unquote sort of linguistic oriented communities in the internet sense. And because there are explicit rules against politicking in these places for obvious reasons, because it just it destroys the core of what those quote unquote communities are supposed to be about. So I'm not sure if you were specifically talking about politics, but it strikes me as when I've interacted with denizens of California, that what they tell me, they're almost like undercover agents because I don't actually interact with proper SJWs or what have you,
Hmm.
rarely at least. They say, well, I don't really believe all this, but I work this job in San Francisco, or not just in Cal, or in Seattle, or what have you, and I have to go through the motions and pay lip service. It's it's kind of like the Catholic Church in the High Middle Ages. I mean, you might not believe in it, but you better be quiet about not believing in it. You go along with it just in case, and that becomes a huge obstacle to really getting anywhere. And so I'm interested. I'm sorry I keep on interrupting, but I just want to sort of add to whatever you're saying on occasion. Maybe you could expand on what you mean by approaching them in your own terms. I know that privately we've talked about your adventures with what you might what one might regard as sort of oddballs or people that uh, might come from different parts of human thought, so to speak. So,
Right.
yeah.
So when it comes to identifying what the other person or the other person's perspective, right, or their own language, it takes a while in the sense that you kind of have to throw an idea at them and then see how they respond back, right? It's this game of catch and throw, catch and throw, catch and throw, and it's yeah. In the beginning, you're kind of playing undercover, but what I found is a lot of people are just undercover, and um, this is like kind of what I would call a soft bluntness,
Mm,
right? Where you're able to talk to someone in a very, very blunt manner, but you're not doing it in a way that is to cause harm, but it's soft, right? You want to have impact in what you say, and you want them to understand that impact, right? Which is why it is important. It's so important to be articulate in these matters where you unfortunately have to qualify everything that you say. And as you go further along the conversation, if you've qualified everything correctly in the beginning, there will be less to qualify because you and the other person have come to a certain understanding, right? And you cannot at the same time allow your own ideology or your own ideas to interfere with the point that you're trying to articulate. Um, and that's what's so important with interacting with people who are seemingly SJWs, right?
mm,
It's that, okay, on the surface, they might appear to have certain views, but if you get them uh, to talk a little bit more by throwing out ideas at them, where you're doing it in a manner where you were genuinely trying to understand them and you were genuinely being curious, right? And you throw out, I don't know, maybe you throw out idea A and then you throw out idea B, which contradicts idea A in some kind of sense, right?
mm.
It allows the other person to flesh out things or even think about things. And eventually you're just going to hit a point where the other person is at, they just malfunction, right? And then you just stop the conversation there.
Mm.
And then you come back another day, right? But
I mean,
that's just
mm,
usually how it goes.
spoke of
But
the incentive though. So again, I have to ask myself, why would anyone be incentivized to go through all those layers? I mean, peeling away at the onion. Yeah, I mean, which then reinforces this idea that you'd rather just flee to the internet and just deal with people of somewhat like mind.
right, I mean, it's just your own personal tolerance for these kinds of things. Like for me personally, I have a pretty high personal tolerance to trying to understand people, seeing how people grow, because I genuinely uh, want to see want to see people grow, or I want to see how people think about things. Because for me, like I never assume that I have the right perspective, but rather I assume that, oh, hey, there's a different perspective. Maybe I'm wrong in a certain sense, right? And if you yourself are someone who is seeking truth, you cannot assume that you are right about everything. Um,
No, I totally agree. But
yeah,
if what you're going to encounter is sort of a litany of standard SJW talking points, then in some sense, experience has shown, well, yeah, I've heard this before. Not discounting the possibility that one might hear something new that might in fact be true, but
mhm.
um, yeah.
Yeah. At a certain point, you just kind of have to. You'll learn how to filter who's a smart cookie and who's not one.
Hmm.
Eventually, I mean, like you shouldn't have these conversations with like everyone, right?
Hmm.
But there are a certain number of intelligent people where you can have these conversations with. It's just not everyone. And I'm not saying that it should be everyone.
I'm curious though, having spoken now so frequently fragmentation, what's, hmm, I mean, you have an experience as a quote unquote Asian American, at least this terminology, but of a particular background and what have you. Do you think that in the United States in particular, because this has long been my observation, that part of the problem in the United States, which is itself sort of ground zero, and then California is like ground zero plus plus, is that because the United States culture is predicated simply on economic success and materialism is sort of its main substance for the most part, that, and I'm convinced that that is for most people insufficient, as in it doesn't nourish the so-called soul. That part of the fragmentation has a lot to do with that, which is to say, people look for political groups, cultural groups, whatever. But in your own case, coming from the Chinese Vietnamese diaspora, I mean, we have observed together in private that within your quote unquote community, there are even certain linguistic features that have emerged that are somehow differentiated from, I guess you could say, more mainstream variants of the English spoken California. That would indicate a relative isolation, you know,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah,
separation. I mean, and we don't want to turn this to bore people into a linguistic talk. That's for us to discuss privately, perhaps. But
yeah. You end up having like these.
you go on.
You end up having enclaves in California where a specific community ends up growing itself, and most of the time they end up becoming like pockets of time of where of the time period that they had immigrated from, right? And you see intergenerationally that their kids end up developing their own accent, their own community in it just due to their upbringing being very, very similar, right? Their parents had the same ideas, and the pain that the next generation suffers from the previous generation allows the next generation to create a stronger bond because of these shared trauma,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's kind of um, important for these small multi-generational enclaves. Um,
So it's safe to say you grew up in an enclave.
am, maybe.
But I mean, you've pointed out that, so for example, were a person from your enclave, or very broadly, sort of the Asian American experience, to encounter, say, your average European American, there would be naught else to talk about save for the weather.
Right, yeah, or like save for like some kind of similar interest, like geology or something, right?
Right. Some
And
random
that's a lot
interest
more
that
rare.
happens to intersect, right? But otherwise,
Right.
the common shared experience is lacking. And I think that in general, that is kind of very much characteristic of the United States more broadly, because you have this country that emerged, in my humble opinion, as an attempt to usher in a modern plutocracy, and on top of that, as cultural reinforcement of the United States is all about wealth and material gain. People emigrate not because the United States is some great beacon of culture necessarily, but because they they leave the mother country in order to have a better life in the United States and that sort of thing. But the problem when you're leaving a place is to another place, especially when it's just predicated on wealth and material gain, is it again, it doesn't fill that niche of the soul, and so you end up having these. Who knows how many communities exist, whatever they're based on, culture, ethnicity, religion, or a mix of all of the above, or even well, politics, that people in the United States find it very difficult to interact with each other, provided they are not from a particular sphere. And so, being American, I've certainly experienced throughout my my many winters, does not confer upon you a sense of relatedness that I have routinely observed in other quote unquote nationalities that are much more based on long inherited traditions and and cultural settings that have, of course, changed over time, but nonetheless are identifiable. I've observed it with Finns, I've observed it with the Flemish, I've observed it even with Germans to some slightly more limited degree, but nonetheless. And that, I mean, of course, there's a stereotype, right, where the Americans, I've encountered Americans abroad who ask what I think about the Broncos, and I think nothing because I don't follow it at all. And there's a signal, which, I mean, I don't want to get too much into linguistics, but the fact that my phonology is almost entirely American is a kind of cultural signal as well. Then people make all sorts of assumptions about you. But yeah, I think this is one of the linchpins of the problem, so to speak, in the United States. It just, and this is why it's also why it's ground zero. And I believe as well, to be perfectly honest, the harbinger of things to come elsewhere throughout the world, but particularly in Europe, but I think in general throughout the world, where if all you have is material wealth and things to entertain you, and make no mistake, it's important to have enough to eat, and it's up to a certain threshold, although I think that threshold is like $70,000, enough to buy things that amuse yourself. But what's left after that? Um, I think the question, certainly in the mainstream, is not really posited. I mean, one thing I've said repeatedly in many circles wouldn't be the first times that I think the United States is largely a failed experiment. But if you're going to run the experiment, that is a plutocracy where the main incentive is simply the acquisition of material wealth rather than some kind of tr tradition-based cultural cohesion, then you need to acknowledge what the potential problems with that might be. And people, I mean, the mainstream and as well as academics, I'm not sure if they're doing it simply because they don't want to be put in the stocks or otherwise hanged, but I think that yeah, it's never been tried before. A giant country filled with dozens of different religions, ethnicities, peoples who are just supposed to get along because they all, according to some people, pay taxes there and follow the law and yeah, want to get a big house. That does not strike me as a formula for any sort of long-term success, which then leads to the extent there are communities, communities within communities, but also the thing you talked about, where you have this intergenerational passing down of traditions, awareness, trauma, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, I'm obviously not Vietnamese or Chinese, but from based on what you said, that so the trauma of the Vietnamese war experience in perhaps both Vietnamese and Chinese Vietnamese diaspora is still present to some degree, even in the young whippersnappers such as yourself, you might say, right?
Right, yeah, because like there's always that thought of, oh hey, I'm living in a very privileged position comparative to everyone before me. Like that's always reminded. You don't forget that type of thing.
Mm.
even going to uh, Vietnamese supermarkets, right? You would, or I would see at a very, very young age, I would see kids being affected by Agent Orange, and the reality of war was always very, very apparent because you would see these disfigured children
Hmm.
right at the cashier, right? People asking for a donation. And you don't really forget that kind of thing um, as a child when you're going to the grocery just for food, but you leave feeling bad, right? Um, or like even the shared experience of parent tiger parenting, right?
Hmm.
Like that's very, very common amongst a lot of Asian Americans, and um, the the trauma that does come from tiger parenting of not being able to develop your own personality or even um, learn how to socialize properly with the general public, right? Because there are traps that the older generation uh, produces for the younger generation, but it's a whole other rabbit hole, honestly.
Yeah, and it just goes to show, I mean, and these are not American phenomena. These are phenomena particular to a certain community with a certain background. And I think that reinforces the point that there can never be an American community because there's no tie that binds, and material wealth can't be that tie. It simply it manifestly doesn't work. There's another reason I've observed where you've seen a significant resurgence in interest in formal religion. A lot of people that used to be irreligious or just straight up atheistic, shifting towards a more religious conviction. I have no idea how authentic it is at times, but because people are just desperate for something to cling to, and some of them delve quite deeply into it, and others more superficially. But when I listen to your story, and or I listen to sort of religious conversion stories, which I'm fond of listening to, because I just it's sort of almost like a sociological survey, right? For me, you you really get that sense of what people are after something that just don't have, and it is a it's a very American thing, but in general, it's a very Anglo thing I've noticed. These are sort of the quest for some sort of identity, the quest for some sort of belonging seems much stronger throughout the Anglo-Saxon speaking world, whether it's Australia, Canada, United Kingdom, or the United States, than say continental Europe. I
Hmm.
having interacted, especially with German speakers and Dutch speakers, and that those kinds of questions, although they still exist, just seem less relevant. And I'm wondering, is this because these places are just much more uniform still, and they haven't been running this plutocratic experiment? I'm not. I mean, not that. Yeah, it's. I- I'm
I think
not.
that
Go on,
in
please.
particular I think in particular with Asian Americans, this does also occur, but it manifests in different ways, and the Asian Americans try to find a different solution, uh, called raving, right?
Hmm.
Most of the time, the shared interest would be quote unquote music, right? Your community is called your uh, rave family, and your quote
What does
unquote
this stand for, rave, in this context?
as in like a concert, usually like EDM, trance,
Hmm.
yeah, some kind of particular musical interest, right? You're just going there to see sets. That's what they call them.
Hmm.
Um, and within these within raves, right? You see people have their rave family, and even on top of that, they have also what you call your rave bae, which is the other individual that you're supposed to be able to rely on to take care of you, to be close with, right? There's this easy want to have, but unfortunately, the problem with raves is that it's temporary, right? So when you see people come back from these, or when you see people in these raves, they're enjoying it, they're having a great time, but once they leave, it's just hollow all over again because they're just going back to real life, right? Their raves have become their churches, their ceremonies,
Mm.
and for most Asian Americans, that's where they go to find, or sometimes that's where they go to find their sense of community.
You know,
Because there is a difference between someone who is Asian American versus someone who is Chinese American, just culturally. It's very, very different.
oh yeah, and I mean I've said this in the past, but this is not anything new. I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, I noticed, particularly with Asian Americans, that there were strong lines of separation. I I remember many moons ago when I was an undergraduate, that I had been on the cusp of beginning a dalliance with a Korean American female at the time. This is, like I said, eons ago, and she at the time was studying German. This is how I got to know her, and her cohort, also Korean Americans, forbade her from further interaction with me, even though I think that there was some mutual interest there. Simply because I'm not Asian American or Korean for that matter, so it just, yeah, I was excluded from that. And the divisions were just, looking back, it's so apparent. You had the so-called fobs, right, the fresh off the boats, who, despite being of the same ethnicity, whether Korean or Chinese, those are the uh, biggest groups that were represented in my area. Hardly any interaction took place. So the Chinese fobs would stick with each other, and the Chinese Americans would exclusively hang out with each other, yet employ English in their daily life as a medium of communication. Likewise with the Korean Americans, and of course with the Korean fobs, it was Korean. So yeah, this has always been there. It's been burgeoning for quite some time, and I think that people are reluctant to talk about it in the open, but it's a serious issue in the United States, and people, it doesn't make sense to scratch your head in a state of perplexity that, oh, the United States, everyone's fighting all the time and it's really politicized and all this stuff. I mean, this stuff has been there for quite some time. People, I speak to people and they act as if this is just brand new. Were they not paying attention in the days of yore? Were they not were they just blind to their surroundings? I think everything was, yes, things were ostensibly better back in the day because large measures social media wasn't a presence, but this stuff was there almost certainly. And I think, getting back to the original question of community, uh, well, how do you forge a proper community in a modern world? Well, one suggestion I have is, look, it might be that fundamentally community is born of necessity, is born out of the exigencies of your environment, which then forces you to band together. But there's a new exigency that has emerged. There's a new challenge, I think, and that challenge is, it's not the material by and large. For the most part, there's some still people that live in dearth, but they're the minority because we have enough to eat and we have our gadgets. The new type of survival, to sort of twist Tyler Durden's words a bit, it's I hate to use this word, spiritual. It's something that is social. So we have enough to eat now, but we're starving. Our souls are starving. Our minds are starving for something of substance that can nourish what we need. Now, it might, and to draw the analogy further, which again might be a bit hyperbolic, we know that extreme lack of social contact can have absolutely catastrophic health consequences physically. So, in some sense, there's a real need for genuine community that has to be born of a new necessity, the necessity of otherwise being completely isolated in a world where your every wish in a material sense, provided you have the means, and most people do because it's not that expensive typically these days, is granted to you. And I think that needs to be acknowledged as the challenge going forward. So if community again was born out of the necessity of a hostile environment and the need to cooperate and adversity and disadvantage, then there needs to be acknowledgement now that there's a new need that needs to be nourished and fed. And if community is to do that, if we need to think about strategies collectively, individually, that might bring that about. I think that sure, I mean, and it can't be the tired and hackneyed suggestions of I don't know, sort of just take a shower, bruh, hit the gym, find a good wife, start a family, because these are not options for the vast majority of people. Certainly not for the vast majority of men. The people who actually suggest this as authentic, legitimate options are either deluded or they're so cut off from other people's reality that they might as well be. So the question is, yeah, a modern community will also be born of necessity, but I actually see I hate to use the term white pill, a small white pill here, right? It's my idea. Just it's a brainstorming. This is
Hmm.
informal conversation after all. So we've observed now during the course of our talk that your case being Chinese Vietnamese diaspora and what that there's sort of very specific circumstances that are then reiterated through a historical cycle, then reinforced through observation, the Agent Orange and what have you. What if what if we acknowledge through our shared experience of social isolation, psychological deprivation, and just general lack of human interaction, that could be a new bridge that we could use to join otherwise disparate peoples or otherwise disparate individuals. Um, because it seems to me it's a pretty important common experience, that sense of being left out there to float in the ether, even though technically you have everything you need. You're told at least you have enough money and you have a computer and you have an Xbox and what have you. That could be the basis of something. But I wouldn't rely on the mainstream or even academics to point this. I'm sure some academics point out that people don't really get along and there's a lack of community, but I've yet to hear, and I think it's just because it runs so counter to the orthodoxy, that you can't really run a country based simply on plutocratic values. And by that, I don't even necessarily, well, I do mean sort of the rule of wealth, but wealth itself being money is the great Satan, right? Is the sort of deity, right? I just don't think it works. But there could be some new acknowledgement that, look, we're kind of all in this strange boat brought about by the post add how many posts you want modern world, and so we can maybe make something of this. Maybe we can do something with this. We can find common ground. If only people would take their blinders off and drop the politicization. Of course, the politicization is, of course, a consequence of all this other stuff we've been talking about. I don't think it's alien at all. It's understandable why everything's so politicized because in lieu of religion, I mean, this has been pointed out by many religious people. If without God, you'll create your own God, right?
Yep. And I think at the end of the day, individually, people have to just learn how to hear people's stories as stories and not try to add in any type of political spin to it either. Because I think that just becomes unhealthy in the sense that it develops a uh, me versus you type of thing,
Mm.
and it doesn't make the other person comfortable at all. And if you do want to try to develop some kind of olive branch, I think it has to be done at an individual level first, and that has to be mastered before you can do it on a bigger cultural societal level. Just
Yeah.
because if you're unable to do it with another individual or another group of people, there's no way that that's going to happen.
Well, you mentioned olive branches. I mean, the olive branch implies some notion of charity, right? Yet, I think charity is in quite short supply these days. I mean, I don't think it's any.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Why nobody's inclined towards that? I mean, it's the trap we mentioned at the beginning, is it not? It's just it's just easier to dive into your quote unquote community, second definition of the term, where it's just nice and comfortable and cozy, rather than go through the the difficult and treacherous journey of trying to be charitable to someone and offer. I mean, to the average person, or not even the average, to most people, it just doesn't seem plausible. And it's usually, look, in my own experience, it's usually, you've tried that. You've tried to hear the mainstream view or the sort of progressive view of things,
Hmm.
and you try to be charitable. And the problem, I mean, from speaking from a political angle, is they're not willing to concede any ground that there might be another perspective that might be valid to some large subset of the population as well. No, I get the sense that to the extent that this subset of the population exists, they're simply to be either ignored or the world would be better off without them outright. So it, when you go through that experience enough times, you just think, well, is it really worth it? I'm totally on board with the idea of interacting with people of different views and different backgrounds. And I hate this term, a truth seeker, but because it sounds extremely overused. Yeah, but there's a difference between interacting with somebody who is not trying to present a political agenda, whether it's just superficial or just in their entirety presenting that, and
Hmm.
then somebody who just wants to have a conversation, whatever disagreements there might be there. You like your spot in California, and I think California is a hellish place, but we can still get along. Well, that's probably not a good example, but uh, yeah. So I get why people don't want to offer charity, but it's only because I've tried to. I've tried to be charitable, but it needs to be based on some measure on some kind of reciprocity. And I find in general that the left specifically doesn't offer that. They don't grant it whatsoever. Now, it could be in some alternate reality if the right were ascendant, that it would be the same issue. Probably would be. People tend to be like that. But um, I, yeah, so I can, my own interactions with people, it's just really hard. And
Oh, yeah, definitely.
I think though, at the end of the day, if people are really looking for concrete solutions, the things that they can do, well, do avail yourself of the internet, I think. These aren't even suggestions, these are observations on my part. Avail yourself of the internet, take advantage of the plethora of people out there in the ether with whom you might connect, but don't not just on purely ideological grounds. I mean, I have to say that the way how I got to know the gentleman I'm talking to, who I consider a friend now, was not necessarily through ideology, but just sort of, I mean, although I suppose it occurred in some ideological environment, but it's certainly not the glue that binds us. I wouldn't say that. At least I don't feel it is for me. I'd say, I'm not a mind reader. I'd say it's the same for you, right?
Oh, definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean,
So if that's the best we can do these days, do take advantage of the technology. Try to find people, not just of like mind, but try to find people that, yes, if you can find them of like mind, great, all the better. But people that are willing to, certainly in conversation, willing to go the full mile with you and just talk about any range of topics. I mean, I'm a rather messy person, and my friend here is very fastidious, and that'll come up occasionally. But that has nothing to do with ideology. I mean, it just shows that there's a range of things that you can address and talk about, rather than the little box worldview that is typically available. And I think if I were to make a suggestion, which I'm always loath to do, I mean, that's probably the best we can do in the current year. The IRL thing, if you have that option too, yeah, do that as well. But again, IRL options are kind of one. I think one could say justly that the internet kind of levels the playing field, whereas if you're living in California or near San Francisco, LA, that's a very different scenario than, being in Newton, Iowa or something. Whereas, so the opportunities available are different in that environment versus a much more isolated one. So I think, yeah, just that that probably is your best option. And even then, I've no doubt, for example, in a different dimension, were my friend and I to live in close proximity, that we'd spend a fair amount of time together undertaking things. But you know, separation and distance and what have you. So that's of course a disadvantage. And if I want that, you can't really overcome that necessarily. But I think the best we can shoot for are approximations. But we have to, I think, to the extent people in academia and mainstream actually care, they need to acknowledge certain basic fundamental problems. They can't just keep on ignoring this stuff and pretend everything's peachy keen. It's not. It's not been for quite some time. That I find most aggravating. There there's a tremendous amount of mental suffering that is taking place, even as we speak, despite these very people who are suffering mentally, psychologically, having ostensibly everything they need. Ostensibly. This is not helped by the eternal lockdowns in many places, incidentally. But yeah, I I don't know if there could be some macroscopic project undertaken by uh, the mainstream. But when I look to it myself, I just think, look for people not just of like mind, but people who are curious. I think you put it, about the world, and who, yeah, who value human beings beyond the ideological lip service points they're willing to tally up. I'm not sure I have too much else to say. It's unfortunately one of those topics where we, like everything in the postmodern world, we tend to dissect things and sort of deconstruct, but solutions are far and few between. And the ones I hear, as I said, like, just have a shower and find a wife. I mean, it's increasingly becoming something akin to, just become a millionaire. This is the sort of, that's how slapstick some of this advice has become. So, any thoughts on your end?
yeah, I think the thing is that a lot of it is just luck, and a lot of it
Oh,
is
yes.
just timing. I mean,
Yes.
if you want to develop that community, right, on a more personal level, there are certain time periods where you can develop that. But I think past your late 20s, it's just way more difficult, and that your childhood should be taken advantage of, but a lot of people don't draw attention to that. Um,
Yeah,
even universities should be taken advantage of. But you know,
absolutely. The older you get, the harder everything gets. There's no question about that. Mental,
yeah,
physical decay, but also just social decay.
yeah.
Not
So
least of
you
which because people become set in their ways, and yeah.
right, yeah. So you there. So you generally have to live life in a way where you don't try to screw yourself over from the beginning, and that timing is everything,
Mm,
and you need to take advantage of that timing. But being able to identify it is way more difficult if you're not interacting with uh, the older generation on a personal level.
mm,
But
yeah. Well said. Well said. Were we to have more time, it'd be fascinating to explore sort of the historical aspects of the Vietnamese or the Chinese diaspora. But as it's quite late over there and fairly early here and what have you, I think we'll probably call it quits for now. But I'll thank my guest for joining me.
thank you
And
for having me.
well, it's always a pleasure. You're a very fine individual indeed. And
Thank you,
thank
flattering.
the audience for tuning in. And if I'm still alive until the next time, and may the gods watch over you. Enjoy your Friday and your forthcoming weekend. Everyone, take care. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.